to ask a question, we'd ask that maybe you just stand up so everybody around can hear your question, and you could also let know if your question is being directed primarily to Bob or primarily to Gord.
I'd be very surprised if I said all those things and I got no question.
Okay, I have a question. I don't know how to phrase this right, but since the flood of June 2013, I've been trying to figure out what I want to see happen so that we don't see another flood like this. Initially, I thought, okay, we just build a much bigger dam somewhere to hold back the bow and look at it. And then I start realizing that we have to look further upstream, and that's where the interest in the ghost comes in. So the ghost affects the bow affects Calgary. So what can we do so that we don't see another flood like Calgary? I mean, ideally there wouldn't be a Calgary built in the floodplain or in flood areas. We're looking at proposals to make room for the river, all that kind of stuff. And now I'm thoroughly confused because I can see where everything you've said tonight makes absolute total sense. But still, do we need some kind of a geoengineering solution as well, which might involve a huge dam holding back more of the ghost or the bow? So I'm just confused. Where do we go?
Okay, well, first of all, I want to point out that Gordon's right, that there are historic floods of the magnitude that we have seen. I mean, and what happened in Calgary was not that unusual. That's happened within living memory. Those are floods of variability that we've already hugely experienced in settlements. So we know what's coming. The problem is, and I'm sure Ron Casey and Dr. Swan would agree with me, the problem is that when it happens to you, you want to make a knee-jerk reaction and think of everything immediately that you can do to make sure that doesn't happen. Again, this is very typical, incidentally. But what we're seeing now is the responses that we've had in the past are not adequate. And simply rushing to large-scale infrastructure works is probably not helpful to you, because we have to recognize that we're going to have to use absolutely everything that we've got to stabilize the hydroclimatic circumstances in a way that will allow us to be able to adapt to these circumstances. So what I'm telling you, if you're confused that there's a whole range of things that have to be done, well, the rest of the world is waking up to that too. We're not alone in this, by any stretch of the imagination. But what we're finding is established frameworks, even established engineering traditions that were built on statistics that came from a period of relative stability are no longer adequate to serve us in these particular circumstances. So it requires how we live, thinking about how we live on the land and how we use the land and every natural device available to us to help support us in this management. And that's new, it's very demanding. And again, this is what happens when you get to a situation where you're running the Earth system. And it's a complicated project. Now, specifically in any given area, it's a context-driven circumstance. And I think it's very hard to develop policy on the run. When you're in an emergency, we've got to get ahead of this. We've got to catch up with the Keeling curve and then get ahead of it and know what to do in those circumstances. And again, we should use international example wherever possible. And we should really start understanding that what we're doing is not adequate at the moment. Gord, would you like to respond?
Thank you. I don't know what I can add to that other than put together a montage here, and I was talking with some of the folks earlier when we came in, and this was a correlation actually that was brought to our attention by Bill Motherwell after looking at these mountain legacy pictures, and I encourage you all to go and look at them. It's really quite an interesting website. The guys at ESRB introduced it to us when we met with them. Looking at just three examples here of the ghosts, 1, 2, and 3, 1988, it's hard to really see this image is kind of fuzzy, but you can see quite a large area here which has been burned by a forest fire. This is actually just immediately west of the first cut block that SLS took in 2008. And that's what it looked like just to the west in 2009, covered in trees. And so when we look back at the graph, we see that in 1897 there was a pretty major flood. And so was there a correlation there with the fire contributing to the flood? I find it really intriguing when you start comparing the timing of these pictures with the measure flood events on the river. And similarly here again, it's kind of great to see this is, so the quoted area is logged at the time of this picture in 1917, and then in 1929 and 32 there were flood events. Is that a correlation? Is it a coincidence? Absolutely.
Yes.
I have a question. I have a bunch of stuff in my lap, so I hope everyone can hear. I guess it's about, if you project into the future, I think a lot of corporations are probably going to want to see profitability across the globe. Everybody, that's part of the drive of humanity. So how can you tackle exactly what we need to do? And I can see what you're saying as well, how if you maintain the soils and everything else, it's ultimately going to be profitable, but how do you...
You're not shut down capitalism.
Well, I know it's not a problem, but
Okay,
it's a realistic kind of
Yes,
issue.
go ahead. Right, first of all, I want to say that we're not going to get anywhere unless we have corporations.
That's exactly it, but how do you...
Absolutely not. Now, what's really interesting, I think more and more corporations are beginning to understand that these are absolute strategic threats to their existence in many cases, almost sometimes directly. And if not, it can affect supply chains, it can affect customer base, it can affect so many things, as we notice when you have big flooding in Asia that Toyota can't produce car parts, you know? So what we're also seeing is corporations are beginning to think their way through this, and I think it's very important. And I think you'll find on Thursday of this week, the Global Economic Forum is going to publish a report which will say that water and water-related climate issues is the single greatest threat to corporate progress and performance that we presently face globally. So we're having this shift, you know, it started, but my concern always has been we lack urgency, and we plan but we don't do. And the thing you don't want, and I've been in countries where this has happened, where this gets away on you. And if it gets away on you, you don't have the means. Governments in themselves, I'm not sure even have the power to control and manage this themselves. I think we all need to be engaged in the private sector as a major part.
So who should lead that then?
Well, I think there's leadership in so many levels, in so many domains. The person who consciously goes out and does things on their property to increase absorption, to produce better soils, to think about what they can do on their own property as a leader. What you do in your community as a councilor or a mayor matters, and what you do in your corporation. You don't have to be the CEO to do it. The things that you say, and one of the things that's really important, and I meant this about the conversation about us not talking about it, we have to get this at the dinner table. Right now, this is something we just, there's a silence around the silence about talking about climate change. And I think if we get working together and all of us assume whatever leadership we can in the circumstances we have, I think we could do an enormous amount in a relatively short period of time. But we have to stop listening to bad advice, stop justifying inaction, and we have to start really seriously thinking about what it's going to cost us if we make bad development mistakes in the future. And that's why matters like this are important. Now again, I want to point out something that I thought you were very astute in this. I'm not opposed to logging, but I think we've got to look at these practices in the context of these changing circumstances. And if we just rush in to get the last bid out before those circumstances are identified, I think that's ethically objectionable. So what I'm saying
is, the thing that's incredibly frustrating is that we could have a Spray Lakes representative over here with his scientist who's going to say what we're doing is okay. And these are our studies that show it's okay. And we certainly went through that in Briar Creek because they had their scientists. There are other people there saying, no, it's not true. And Spray Lakes had the ear of the government. And that their scientists all say one thing. What do we do about that? How do we do that when we've got these opposing points of view?
well, I understand your point. And I understand
government.
part of the problem has been the direction that science is taking in this country, which is less and less a curiosity-based and more focused on application. That's one of the elements. But the thing is, it must always be recognized that you can only take the science so far, and beyond that, it's a matter of choice. It's people like our MLAs have to sit back and make those judgments. So we ought to be doing everything we possibly can, and I'm really grateful to see 2 MLAs here tonight. I mean, to have sitting politicians at these sessions is exactly what we must do. And I think that's all I can tell you on that. There's always going to be differences. Science works that way. Go ahead.
Yes. I've just finished reading Naomi Klein's This Changes Everything,
What'd you think?
Climate and Capitalism. And the thing that is really hitting home to me, and I'm thinking about it a lot, is her first chapter looks at the Heartland Institute, the deniers in the United States. Guys, she said, that have no science background, but with calculations on the back of an envelope, figure they've trumped climate scientists around the world. And she says they actually understand the consequences of climate change better than we do. And that what we've done, progressive people have not demanded of progressive parties that they address this. And we've got an election next year, and I don't know who to vote for, because there should be some party standing up and saying that our land base is important, that our soils are important, that water is important, and that these are public properties. But perhaps they aren't doing it because there aren't enough of us asking them, demanding, telling them that that's what we want. So that's my question, is how do you get a citizenry?
You asked several really
Did I?
difficult questions. But first of all,
But you're a very smart
man.
man.
The Heartland Institute and deniers and denials. Now, a great deal, I mean, science is catching up with this. Social sciences are coming up with understanding of the psychology and philosophy of denial, and how you can build perfectly flawless logical arguments based on false suppositions at the heart and arrive strongly believing this. And we're beginning to understand how that works. And what we've also discovered, and I was recently at a very major workshop on exactly that problem, which Naomi Klein's book was discussed again, was the fact that we don't need to be focusing on denial anymore. It's harder and harder for deniers to manage to generate the psychic tension that is required to constantly be fighting this illogical argument. So where the real action appears to be is in that floating middle. Intelligent people whose minds can be changed by new and better information properly communicated. This floating center of people who are not necessarily fully politically aligned, but who together can be highly influential in doing exactly what you're talking about. And the floating center, I mean, this floating middle has to identify itself and understand that it has considerable power. Deniers in the United States represent 11% of the people who have taken an active tack in addressing climate concerns. And what we have really seen there is the psychology associated with that is identified with ideology, with anti-regulation, fanaticism, and a whole range of other political things that really don't interest me. Dr. Swan?
Could I just add to some of the good conversation about how we influence the decision makers and the debates, the science around who's right and who's wrong? The reality is that, I don't know about wrong, but I've had very few people come to me as an MLA to talk about water management, land use management, limits to growth. I know a lot of people care, but we don't actually get letters or visits or pressure to actually change what we're doing. In the opposition, I certainly get lots of opposition around homelessness and child care issues and poverty and workers' compensation unfairness. Those are the sorts of things that I see as an opposition that are here. I've had less than 5 people in 10 years talk to me about climate change in my office. I know lots of people care, but somehow I don't think they believe that we can make any difference to it, or that we We want to hear from people, but if we don't have the pressure from citizens, it's hard for us to make it a big deal. And I think, I don't know what you think, Ron, around the caucus table, how you raise something if you haven't got quite a number of people who are saying the issue is important to you. And the evidence is piling up. You want to comment, Ron?
Sure. No, and I agree, David. I mean, I don't think I've heard climate change really come up as a conversation anywhere. Certainly around carbon or a carbon tax or some, you know, in that vein, but not around climate change per se, right? It's more a concern about how do you deal with a carbon tax and how do you structure that kind of conversation, but around climate change per se, no. I mean, certainly in my constituency, we've had lots of issue and we'll always have lots of issue around development on the eastern slopes and around industrial use in the eastern slopes. And so we've certainly had a lot more conversation, a lot more sort of interaction around that level of development there for sure. There's no questioning that.
So this level of education that you've given us tonight, Bob, is absolutely essential for MLAs.
You bet.
To have any sense of how we're evaluating various development projects, especially in the face of a failed land use framework so far in Alberta. People are dragging their feet and slowing the confirmation of our land use frameworks, which are built around each of the river systems. I think Ted Morton needs to be celebrated for getting that framework into place. They still haven't got it enacted. And then we all need pressure on us to say, get this framework in place so we can start to put limits on logging, recreation, oil and gas, whatever it is. We have no basis for limiting any development in this province without a land use framework to say, this is appropriate, this is nowhere near appropriate when you think about the whole system.
Sure.
I'm involved in the problem of fracking north of Parkland. And what I've learned today and what I heard today is very, very similar to the problems and getting it into the government and get the government to do anything. It was mentioned that writing to MLAs and all this kind of stuff, we have done that. Thousands of letters, personal, from groups and so forth. We had probably not even 1% of replies. And what we got back was boilerplate stuff signed by the Minister of Energy. It had nothing to do with the problem. Now this situation here is, by the way, that people get sick, house die, all this kind of stuff. I'm just indicating that that route of going to MLAs, we noticed that those who are not in the caucus have nothing to say. Absolutely nothing.
You mean not in the cabinet? You mean not in the cabinet?
Not in the cabinet.
Okay.
Yeah?
The caucus is the whole elected body.
Oh, okay, sorry. But
The cabinet are the ministers.
Yes. So, it's very, very difficult to get to them. And maybe it requires a little bit something else. Maybe changing the government or something, but it's...
Here.
I'll vote for that.
I just thought I'd throw out an anecdotal comment, and that was years ago I went to a workshop that was hosted by Park the Prairie Adaptive Research Collaborative of Regina, and at that time they were talking about basically living with climate change and what do we do to adapt. So it wasn't about mitigation, it was about adaptation. And I remember my first reaction was, oh my God, we need to stop this. But really, it did raise a very valid point: is how are we going to live with the changes that we occur? And thank you, Bob, for enlightening us on a number of points on that.
We're going to just take two more questions. These two, all right. And just before you do that, though, I just want to make one comment on fracking. Everywhere I go in the country, fracking is a highly contentious issue, especially where mapping of groundwater resources is not complete, and permits are being granted without full knowledge of what's happening in the subsurface. I see that as intentional. Go ahead.
I just want to pick up on that comment about adaptation as we move forward, and I think that's another area where our government's going to start to invest heavily. I'm on the board of the Climate Change and Emissions Management Corporation, and we're dedicating some of our funding to comment or that belief in adaptation was a political no-no because it basically was, admitting defeat in this idea of resisting rather than let's get on with adaptation. And I would think that governments should be encouraged to spend more effort and more resource funding in the area of adaptation. Recognize that we've got this situation and now we need to figure out how to adapt it.
I see hundreds of adaptation plans. I see less than 5% in them. Because they need resources. I'm going to take one last question.
I'm wondering if you could speak to a question of relative magnitude of the thing we're looking at here. The real question is, are we worried about tinkering at the edges when we're looking at coast logging? Because what we're looking at is a major change in hydrological cycle, and therefore, we've got bad stuff coming already. So is that bad stuff so overwhelming that what we do with logging or not logging is swamped by the hydrological changes? Or in fact, are these logging things likely to, in fact, interact with the changes that are coming to give us something far worse? So could you speak to that, the relative magnitude of expected effects?
Okay, well, I think that's a very interesting and important question. And it's interesting because you have to decide where you want to apply your efforts and your resources, right? And I think it speaks to what you said also. I think that adaptation is, we have no choice. And this is one that you can't win. Ron and Dr. Sloan can't get together and come up with a grand master plan to do this. It's going to take everybody and everything we've got to do this. So we have to start managing everything differently so that these effects don't cascade not just through our environment, but through our society, our economic systems, and our political systems, which we're starting to do. So I think we have to work at every level possible, and we have to make truly, we know what sustainable development looks like. We know what works. And we tend to just compromise and let it slip. Can't do that anymore if we want to adapt. And it's a direct link, and there's urgency. Okay, and one of the...
Well, maybe just a final comment on that. As I mentioned earlier about maybe I should pay more for water. And it's kind of like a drive to the bottom. And if we expect to have cheap timber resources, then the logging companies are going to do whatever they can to extract that timber as much and as fast as possible. And so, it's kind of like a vicious cycle which we as consumers are probably in. And so, I just thought I would end with that comment. I know you guys concluded in relation this evening was to share the word, to make people aware of our concerns, and hopefully you'll share the word with someone that you know and elevate the issue and give people like Dr. Swan and Mr. Casey some of your thoughts and your feedback. Thank you.
So we are filled with gratitude tonight to Bob for so kindly and generously volunteering this time to speak with us, to the Alberta Wilderness Association for loaning us their building, and their staff person, Brittany, who's hiding around the corner. We'd also like to thank our neighbors in Calgary flood-affected communities, the CRCAG, Calgary River Communities Action Group, for helping spread the word that this was occurring tonight. We're grateful for their help. And to my neighbors in the Ghost Valley, who possess a deep love for the landscape and an appreciation for the way it supports us all. People like Gord have put in literally hundreds of hours to research this and put together these presentations and realize that we need to speak up. That's the least we can do. And thank you to all of you for caring enough to come out and for continuing to do what you do every day to highlight the importance of water. What we do on the landscape matters. Now, as you go out tonight, Bob has a number of books for sale over here, which some of you have already stopped by and taken a look. There is an opportunity to make a small cash donation. Many of you have already done so. Thank you very much. And there is the opportunity to get involved. Multiple opportunities, whether that be Alberta Wilderness Association, Ghost Watershed Alliance Society, the RBC, which is the Bow River Basin Council, or whether you wanted to connect with the Ghost Valley's community residents who have hosted this evening. If you have been in contact with me already through the RSVP process with your email, I will already have your email address and can send you that follow-up information with links, etc. If you have come in tonight without an email exchange between us, please stop by the table on your way out. Just write your name and email on one of these sticky notes you'll see there, and that's how we'll be able to collect your name and your contact information. As well, some members of the Ghost Valley community have a petition. Bill has a copy of the petition back there. I'm going to get a copy from Bill as well and get it up here on another clipboard, possibly with Gord, so you can stop by and sign the petition if you would like to see logging in the Ghost watershed.
Is that the same one that is online, the change.org?
Reconsider. Good question. There is an online petition through change.org. Online petitions are not legislatively binding in any way, shape, or form, but they're a great way to raise awareness and a great way to get people to engage such that they can continue to receive email updates on the situation. The petition which Bill and Gord will have on hand is a petition whereby once we have a number of signatures, we can submit it to an MLA who then can decide whether or not to present it on the floor of the Legislative Assembly on our behalf.
The MLA should not be deciding that.
Okay, so,
If they have received a petition, they should be tabling it.
okay, so thank you, David, for that, appreciate it. So we are collecting signatures on petitions with the hope that someday we will have that together. But we need your help. Very few of us live in the Ghost Valley. There's about 400 of us. Maybe not all of us are full-time residents. But we just don't have a real big voting base out there. So we really need your help. And the reality is that all these systems are interconnected. What happens in the Ghost Valley will eventually be making its way down to Calgary. We're neighbors. We share the landscape. So back again to mentioning that what we do on this landscape matters. And there is a saying about death by 1,000 cuts, but I heard one the other day about change comes by 1,000,000 steps, and this resonates with me. And you are here tonight being the change. When you leave here, you will go out and be the change, and we thank you for that. You encourage us. Thank you for coming.